February 2016, North Shields, Tyne and Ware, police tape fluttered outside a modest terraced house hiding months of unspeakable cruelty. Inside lay the aftermath of terror, control, and fear. Anne Corbett, once a quiet, compliant woman, now stood at the center of one of Britain's most disturbing murders, the killing of Jimmy Prout, her former partner. How could vulnerability turn into violence? This was not greed or passion, but a collapse of conscience, obedience replacing empathy under the sway of Zahid Zaman, a manipulative leader who ruled through fear. Together, they tortured and humiliated Prout before dumping his body near the Tyne tunnel. Corbett later pretended concern while hiding the truth. Inside Tyne and Ware's most notorious female killers, we expose how loyalty became complicity. Welcome to UK Real Crime, where North Shields' quiet streets whisper secrets and its darkest women are unmasked. What you're about to hear may haunt you long after it ends. First offender, Anne Corbett, 28 years old. February 2016, North Shields, Tyne and Ware, in a quiet corner of England's northeast, a secret of shocking cruelty was about to surface. Behind the closed door of an ordinary terraced house, a group of people lived under a strange, cult-like influence. At the center was Anne Corbett, a woman described as vulnerable, impressionable, and easily controlled. But she would become forever associated with one of Britain's most disturbing modern murder cases, the death of 45-year-old Jimmy Prout. Corbett and Prout were once partners, sharing the same bed and circle of friends. Yet, by late 2015, their home had turned into a place of terror. Under the domination of Zahid Zaman, a self-styled leader, Prout was isolated, humiliated, and repeatedly assaulted. What began as Zaman's obsession with revenge, believing Prout had stolen from him, spiraled into months of systematic abuse. Corbett, along with Kay Rayworth and Myra Wood, became complicit in the cruelty. Prout's suffering ended around the 9th of February 2016. His body was dumped on wasteland near the Tyne tunnel, wrapped in a sleeping bag. When police later found the remains, decomposition had erased much of what he endured, but the evidence of long-term torture was clear. Detectives uncovered a web of lies and attempts to cover up the killing, bank withdrawals, fake letters, and false searches staged to feign concern. At Newcastle Crown Court in June 2017, Anne Corbett sat in silence as the verdict was read. She appeared emotionless, her face pale and drawn, while the judge called the crime a prolonged campaign of cruelty. Zahid Zaman received a whole life order. Corbett was sentenced to life with a minimum of 27 years. Outside court, Jimmy's brother told reporters, "What they did was worse than any horror film. They'll never understand what they took from us." The murder shocked the nation, not only for its savagery, but for what it revealed, that authorities had 17 missed chances to intervene. The official review that followed reshaped local safeguarding laws and forced agencies to act faster when adults show signs of coercive control or neglect. The tragedy leaves 3 enduring warnings. Isolation can be a weapon. Small cruelties, when ignored, grow into crimes, and blind loyalty to control can erase conscience. In the end, this case stands as a grim reminder. Evil rarely begins with violence, it begins when empathy disappears. Second offender, Sharon Swinhoe and his gang. October 2012, Newcastle upon Tyne, a retired civil servant named Peter McMahon vanished after visiting the woman he could never stop loving. To neighbours, Sharon Swinhoe seemed eccentric but harmless, keeping pet rats and a rotating cast of admirers. Beneath that surface, however, was a manipulative streak that prosecutors would later call sinister and controlling. What began as a relationship built on affection would unravel into one of the city's most disturbing murder cases. McMahon, 68, was devoted to the 44-year-old Swinhoe, showering her with gifts and financial help, but by the autumn of 2012, their relationship had soured. She had moved on to a new companion, Joseph Collins, a man who idolized her to the point of submission. On the evening of October 18th, McMahon took a taxi to her home in Crawford Terrace, apparently believing they would reconcile. It was the last time he was seen alive. Inside the small flat, a violent confrontation unfolded. Investigators later found evidence of repeated blows to McMahon's head and face, a fractured eye socket, and other devastating injuries. The coroner ruled that he died of heart failure, brought on by the attack. The most chilling detail was the treatment of his body. Initially hidden in a dog kennel outside, It was later stuffed into a suitcase and taken to Collins's flat in Ellswick, where it was stored inside a chest freezer for weeks. During this time, Swinhoe withdrew money from McMahon's bank account and told friends he had gone abroad. When detectives traced financial activity on his cards, the pattern led them straight to her. On December 20th, police received a call from Swinhoe herself, a calculated attempt to implicate Collins. When officers entered his home, they found the freezer and, inside, McMahon's remains. At Newcastle Crown Court the following July, Swinhoe appeared calm and expressionless. The jury heard how she manipulated men, like magnets, using charm to control and humiliate them. Collins, described as her willing follower, sat beside her, staring at the floor. Judge Globe told the court, "You cared more for the rats you kept than for the man who loved you." Both were convicted of murder. Swinhoe received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. The verdict sent shockwaves through the Northeast. The public struggled to comprehend the cold precision behind her actions, the deception, the calculated disposal, and her lack of remorse. Forensic officers described it as a crime of domination rather than passion. McMahon's family called the killing cruel, calculated, and cold-hearted, mourning a man who died before learning he had become a grandfather. 8 years into her sentence, in February 2021, Sharon Swinhoe died in prison from complications related to COVID-19. Her case remains a chilling study of control and greed, a reminder that manipulation can be as deadly as violence, and that love, when weaponized, can destroy everything it touches. Third offender, Clare Humble, 50 years old. October 2014, Bedlington, Northumberland. In a quiet street lined with modest homes, a 7-year relationship ended in violence so extreme that even seasoned detectives were shaken. 50-year-old Clare Humble and her partner, 49-year-old Peter Headley, had lived together like husband and wife. But behind closed doors, their relationship had become defined by dependence, anger, and control. Headley was frail, living with epilepsy, brittle bone disease, and depression. Friends said he was too gentle for his own good. To Humble, however, he was a burden, one she decided to erase. The assault took place inside their small flat on Burdon Terrace. Forensic investigators later described a chaotic scene of shattered crockery and bloodstains. Headley had suffered multiple broken ribs, a fractured cheekbone, and deep stab wounds. The court heard that Humble had attacked him with a broken bowl and a heavy wooden tabletop. One witness recalled her saying she had simply had enough of him. When Headley stopped moving, Humble's focus turned to hiding what she had done. Detectives quickly linked Humble to the scene through CCTV footage and bank records showing she had withdrawn the victim's money after his death. When arrested, she insisted Headley had suffered an epileptic fit, later claiming he stabbed himself. But as prosecutor Paul Greene told the jury, this was not an accident, it was sustained, deliberate brutality. At Newcastle Crown Court in May 2015, Humble sat expressionless as the judge called her vicious and scheming. Her accomplice, Nicholson, pleaded guilty to perverting the course of justice. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 20 years before parole. Outside court, Peter Headley's sister wept, saying she had warned police her brother was in danger, but no one listened. The community was horrified by the idea of a woman trying to recruit a butcher to dispose of a body. The tragedy exposed a chilling truth about emotional dependency, how affection can be twisted into exploitation, and how cruelty often hides behind the mask of intimacy. Fourth offender, Christina Button, 58 years old. March 2003, West Rainton, County Durham, in a quiet English village where little ever changed, a tragedy unfolded that exposed the dark side of greed and manipulation. 53-year-old George Button, a kind and gentle man, was found unconscious on a country lane after walking his dog, Laddie. At first, it looked like a tragic hit and run, but detectives would soon discover that his death was no accident. It was the centerpiece of a cold and calculated plan for profit. His wife, Christina Button, then 31, had spent years living beyond her means. Court documents revealed that she owed nearly £200,000 on 14 credit and store cards. Her husband's life insurance policy was worth £450,000, a sum large enough to solve all her financial troubles. To make it happen, she enlisted the help of her nephew Simon Tannehill, a man she knew was infatuated with her. Police later said Button used affection as a weapon, exploiting her nephew's loyalty to execute her plan. On a chilly March evening, as George walked his dog down the quiet lane, Tannehill lay in wait. He attacked with a heavy, blunt object, striking him repeatedly in the head. A passerby found George bleeding and motionless, believing he had been struck by a car. He died 2 days later in hospital from severe head injuries. Meanwhile, Christina Button calmly maintained her alibi, taking her young daughter to Brownies, something she rarely did, just as the murder was taking place. Detectives grew suspicious when Button showed little emotion at her husband's death, but quickly filed for the insurance payout. A secret police surveillance video captured conversations between her and Tannehill that hinted at the murder plot. Prosecutors described her as a cold and calculating killer who viewed her husband's death as a financial transaction. During her trial at Newcastle Crown Court, Button sat in silence, her expression blank, occasionally glancing toward Tannehill, who avoided her eyes. The jury found both guilty of murder. Mr. Justice Royce told Button, "This was a wicked and evil killing, orchestrated by you in pursuit of money." She was sentenced to life imprisonment, and Tannehill received the same. Years later, she appealed the conviction, arguing that the police video breached her rights, but the Court of Appeal upheld the verdict. When Christina Button was finally released on parole in 2018, the community remembered her not as a grieving widow, but as a woman who turned love into currency, proof that deceit can wear even the gentlest face. Fifth offender, Heather Emmonds, 58 years old. February 2013, Holywell, North Tyneside. In a quiet housing estate near Whitley Bay, a family argument that had simmered for years erupted into one of the region's most shocking domestic murders. The story of 58-year-old grandmother Heather Emmonds and her daughter-in-law Tina Casey revealed how love, fear, and control can twist into something deadly. Heather Emmonds had always been close to her grandson, but when 42-year-old Tina, her son's on-off partner, announced plans to move back to the Isle of Man with the boy, Emmonds' world began to collapse. Friends described her as consumed with panic, terrified of losing the one bond that gave her life purpose. In the days before the murder, her behavior grew erratic. She tried to poison Tina twice by crushing sleeping tablets into her food, once into a chili, then into a sweet and sour dish. When those attempts failed, she decided to act in person. On the morning of February 3rd, Emmonds drove to Tina's home armed with a filleting knife, gloves, and a change of clothes. Tina was relaxing on the sofa when Emmonds struck from behind. Forensic evidence showed more than 15 stab wounds to her neck, chest, and stomach. After the attack, Emmonds covered the body with a blanket, took her grandson, and went to play bingo. Later that evening, she burned her blood-stained clothes and drove aimlessly through North Tyneside. The following day, she crashed her car after taking an overdose of sleeping pills. Inside, officers found 10 handwritten notes, part apology, part justification. One read, "I couldn't let her take him away from me." When questioned, Emmonds admitted the killing but claimed she had lost control. The prosecution rejected that, pointing to her preparation, the knife, the gloves, the spare clothes, and the prior poison attempts. During the trial at Newcastle Crown Court, the jury took just 2 hours to convict her of murder. The judge told her, "You planned this attack with chilling deliberation. This was not loss of control, it was revenge, driven by obsession." In the courtroom, Emmonds sat pale and silent, her hands clasped tightly as the life sentence was read. Outside, Tina's family expressed quiet sorrow. "No one has won, 2 mothers are gone." The case left a haunting image of ordinary fear turned fatal, a reminder that obsession, once it eclipses reason, can destroy everything love was meant to protect. Sixth offender, Karen Tunmore, 36 years old. January 2004, Sunderland, Tyne and Ware. A 19-year-old man was found dying outside his flat, his skull shattered by a series of blows from a baseball bat. For nearly 14 years, no one knew who killed Scott Pritchard or why. Then, in the summer of 2018, a woman walked into a Newcastle police station and said 6 words that stunned detectives. "I killed him. It was me." That woman was Karen Tunmore, a 36-year-old football coach from Killingworth. By day, she was known for mentoring children and running local girls' football programs. Parents described her as inspirational and kind. But behind that image was a secret she had buried since she was 21, the night she beat a stranger to death over a debt that wasn't even hers. Back in January 2004, Tunmore had been drinking heavily when a friend, known only as Stay, drove her to Sunderland to confront Scott Pritchard over £120 he supposedly owed. Scott, who was on crutches after a leg injury, laughed when she threatened to break his other leg. Enraged, she grabbed an 18-inch baseball bat from the car and struck him again and again. He collapsed against a wall, bleeding and motionless. Stee begged her to stop, but she kept hitting. After the attack, Tunmore dumped the bat into the North Sea and sold her blood-stained car. The murder weapon was never recovered. For years, the case haunted the community and destroyed a family. Scott's father, Robert Stacey, was wrongly accused and spent 16 weeks in prison before being cleared. The accusation ruined his life. He lost his home and lived in fear for over a decade. Scott's mother, Kathleen, sank into alcoholism, convinced her ex-partner was the killer. Then, in July 2018, Tunmore's conscience collapsed. After a suicide attempt and months of hearing voices telling her to do it again, she turned herself in. During questioning, she described details of the killing only the murderer could know: the type of bat, the position of Scott's body, the route she took to dispose of the evidence. She pleaded guilty to murder at Newcastle Crown Court. The judge sentenced her to life in prison, with a minimum of 17.5 years. When the verdict was read, Tunmore stood silent on her crutches, her head bowed. 3 days later, Scott's father died of a heart attack, finally knowing the truth. The confession ended one of Britain's longest-running cold cases, a reminder that guilt never fades, and the past never truly stays buried. 7th offender, Nicola Lee, 44 years old. March 31st, 2019, Jarrow, South Tyneside. What began as another drunken argument between lovers spiraled into a night of violence that ended one man's life and exposed a pattern of rage long ignored. Inside a small terraced home, 44-year-old Nicola Lee, volatile, intoxicated and armed, crossed a line she could never return from. Lee had spent most of her life in chaos. Raised in children's homes and marked by violent relationships, she carried the anger of her past like a weapon. Friends described her as charming when sober, but vicious and unpredictable when drinking. Her partner, 45-year-old Paul Taylor, had learned to live with her temper. Their relationship was turbulent, fueled by alcohol, jealousy, and fights that often ended in blood. Lee had once attacked a previous boyfriend with a garden fork, and another time hit Taylor with a hammer. Yet, as neighbors later said, they always got back together, like fire drawn to fire. In the early hours of that Sunday morning, shouting once again echoed through their kitchen walls. A neighbor heard Lee scream, "I'll kill you, I'll kill you." Moments later, she slashed Taylor's face and plunged a knife into his chest. The single wound pierced his heart. As he fell, she dialed 999, claiming he had stabbed himself. "A lunatic," she said, her voice thick with slurred fury. Police bodycam footage later showed Lee swearing and arguing with officers as they arrested her. Even in handcuffs, she denied responsibility. At Newcastle Crown Court, prosecutors described her as manipulative, calculating, and dangerous. The jury heard of her history of violence and her readiness to reach for weapons during domestic disputes. She maintained her innocence, insisting Paul's death was a tragic accident. The jury rejected murder but convicted her of manslaughter. During sentencing, Lee stood in the dock with cropped hair and folded arms, her expression flat. The judge told her, "You are violent, aggressive, and utterly unpredictable in drink. It was only a matter of time before your violence ended in death." She was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Outside court, Paul's family wept. His mother said she had opened his Mother's Day card just days after burying him. "We just want to grieve for Paul properly," she told reporters. The case remains a chilling portrait of how unchecked anger and addiction can turn love into destruction, proof that violence at home rarely stays behind closed doors. 8th offender, Helena Atay, 44 years old. October 18th, 2018, Birtley, Tyne and Ware, behind the doors of a quiet family home, a marriage once united by tragedy collapsed into another. 42-year-old Helena Atay, once celebrated as a devoted mother and charity fundraiser, stabbed her husband, 45-year-old businessman Atay, in a drunken rage. The killing shocked the same community that had once praised her as Mum of the Year. Helena's public life was marked by compassion. After losing her 2-year-old daughter Sophie to illness in 2010, she raised thousands for children's charities, even receiving support from celebrities like Simon Cowell. But privately, she battled alcoholism and grief that consumed her daily life. By 2018, she was drinking 2 bottles of wine a night. Her husband, Atay, had begged her to stop. That night, when he tried to block her from going out to buy more alcohol, their argument turned deadly. In the chaos of the kitchen, Helena grabbed a 12-centimeter kitchen knife and struck him twice, one blow piercing his heart, right beneath a tattoo reading, "Sophie, my endless love." Fatally wounded, Atay staggered and managed to make a 17-minute emergency call, gasping the words, "999, please," before collapsing. When police arrived, Helena wept and said, "I love you so much, I'm sorry," but later changed her story, blaming business rivals and calling the fight an argument that got out of hand. The investigation uncovered years of turmoil: Helena's drinking, her claims of coercive control, and her violent outbursts. Prosecutors described her as volatile and aggressive when drunk, while the defense argued she was a grieving mother whose trauma spiraled into dependency. During the trial at Newcastle Crown Court, she sat quietly, her face pale and unreadable, as the jury watched body cam footage showing her shifting between hysteria and denial. The jury cleared her of murder, but found her guilty of manslaughter. Judge Paul Sloan QC told her, "You were not prepared to let your husband stand between you and yet another drink." He condemned her attempt to portray Atay as a monster, calling it a wicked distortion of the truth. She was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Outside court, the victim's family said, "He died because he cared, because he tried to help." In the end, Helena's story stood as a tragic mirror of grief turned poison, how love, when drowned in addiction and denial, can destroy the very life it once fought to save. Ninth offender, Janet Dunn, 73 years old. March 15, 2022, Ponteland, Northumberland, in a peaceful village of stone houses and quiet gardens, a 73-year-old great-grandmother finally reached her breaking point. Janet Dunn, once known locally as the friendly school crossing guard, smothered her husband Anthony with a pillow after more than 5 decades of what the court later called coercive control. For 53 years, their marriage had followed the same pattern. Anthony Dunn, aged 81, was quick-tempered and domineering, while Janet lived in silence and submission. Friends saw a quiet woman devoted to her family, but behind closed doors, she endured constant criticism, humiliation, and financial pressure. By the spring of 2022, the couple was drowning in debt, facing the loss of their home. When Janet confronted her husband that morning, desperate about their finances, he reportedly smiled and told her to borrow from their daughter again. That single gesture, detached, dismissive, and familiar, triggered decades of suppressed anger. In the moments that followed, Janet placed a pillow over her husband's face and pressed down until he stopped moving. Realizing what she had done, she left their home and drove to a nearby lake, intending to end her own life. A dog walker found her unconscious in her car hours later. Back at the house, their daughter discovered her father's body and called the police. The investigation revealed a lifetime of emotional control, a woman worn down by years of domination who snapped under the weight of despair. Psychiatric experts testified that she had suffered from depression, anxiety, and what they described as an abnormality of mental functioning caused by prolonged trauma. At Newcastle Crown Court, prosecutors acknowledged her mental fragility but emphasized that she had taken a life. Janet appeared frail in the dock, her voice barely audible as she pleaded guilty to manslaughter by diminished responsibility. Judge Paul Sloan QC described the case as extraordinary, telling her, "You endured decades of compliance and submission before you finally broke." He sentenced her to 5 years and 3 months in prison, noting that the killing was spontaneous, not calculated. Outside the courtroom, her daughters said they were devastated and traumatized, unsure if they ever truly knew their parents. Janet Dunn's story remains a haunting study of endurance, how years of silence, once meant to preserve peace, can ultimately destroy it. 10th offender, Karla Dodds, 27 years old. November 20th, 2022, North Tyneside. The night began with laughter, music, and tequila shots, but ended in sirens and shattered glass. 22-year-old barmaid Karla Dodds, drunk behind the wheel of a small Hyundai i10, made a decision that would destroy more than one life. Dodds had always been known as the live wire of her group, charismatic, impulsive, unpredictable. Once a boarding school student with dreams of becoming a nurse, she now worked late nights in bars and thrived on attention. That night, after finishing her shift, she joined friends for drinks, downing wine and shots before deciding to drive everyone home. 7 people crammed into her 5-seater hatchback. Among them was her close friend, 22-year-old Truman Hubb, described as kind, funny, and full of life. As the car sped through the coastal streets, music blaring, Truman leaned out of the window laughing. Witnesses later recalled hearing screams before the sound of twisting metal. The overloaded Hyundai hit a lamppost at high speed and flipped. Truman was crushed in the wreckage. Dodds, miraculously uninjured, ran from the scene with another friend, leaving behind the chaos she had caused. Police found her hours later. Body cam footage captured her sobbing and slurring, repeatedly asking, "Who's dead?" Detectives noted her blood alcohol level was well over the legal limit. At Newcastle Crown Court, prosecutors said her actions were wicked and cowardly, emphasizing that she had fled rather than help her dying friend. The court also heard that while awaiting trial, Dodds was caught drug driving, testing positive for cannabis, a fact the judge called proof of self-pity, not remorse. When the verdict was read, Dodds stood motionless, her expression blank. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison and banned from driving for nearly 14. Judge Edward Bindloss told her, "You showed no regard for the danger you posed." Truman Hubb's death was entirely avoidable. Truman's mother described her anguish, saying her heart is dead, and that she could never forgive the woman who left her son to die. The case sent shockwaves through social media after police released the arrest footage. Viewers condemned Dodds' reckless disregard for life, reigniting national conversations about drink-driving culture among young people. From this tragedy, 3 warnings emerge. Never underestimate how alcohol impairs judgment, never overload a vehicle beyond its limits, and never assume a few minutes of convenience are worth a lifetime of regret. Reckless choices behind the wheel can't be undone. Karla Dodds' story stands as a grim reminder that one night of arrogance can erase a lifetime of potential. For the victim, for the driver, and for every life their choices touched. Every street in Tyne and Ware hides a story of love turned lethal, of control disguised as care, of ordinary women who crossed the line from victims to perpetrators. From North Shields to Sunderland, these cases reveal the darkest corners of human psychology: obsession, jealousy, greed, and guilt that refuse to die quietly. If these stories left you questioning what drives someone to kill, you're not alone. There are still untold cases buried in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to be heard. Stay with us as we continue to unmask the truth behind Britain's most chilling crimes. Subscribe to UK Real Crime and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story that will haunt you long after it ends.